Between the 1500s and the 1900s, Britain experienced successive waves of migration, both in and out of the country. But why did these mass movements of people take place? What was the experience of the migrants, and how did their comings and goings affect this country and its people? In 1709, this area, which was then on the outskirts of London, became what was probably Britain's first refugee camp. Here at Blackheath, 13,000 German migrants made their camp. They spoke different languages, they belonged to different churches, and crowds of curious Londoners came up here to take a look.
To put that in perspective, that's something like 150, 200,000 people arriving over the course of a summer in London from one particular place.
Successive waves of European migrants had found their way to Britain. Among them, 50,000 French Protestants, known as the Huguenots. After the Huguenots came a smaller group of mainly German migrants, who became known as the Palatines, and were from several different regions, speaking different dialects and belonging to different religious sects, from the Protestant Lutherans to the Catholics. Religious persecution, bad harvests, and the hope of securing free land in America had brought the Palatines to England.
Most of them were people who worked on the land. A lot of them were working in vineyards, which was quite a common occupation in that part of Germany at the time. But there were also a good many skilled migrants. But for people looking through the camps, what they would have seen mostly is poor peasants wearing fairly ragged clothes.
The British owners of the Carolina Company had advertised throughout Germany, sending out pamphlets which portrayed the newly discovered American colony as the promised land in an effort to attract labour.
There's some evidence that the government's representatives in Holland at the time were encouraging these Palatines to get onto boats and come over to London. The government had an ideology that stressed the importance of population, of growing the population as a source of wealth. The government had allies that helped them amplify their message. Daniel Defoe is probably the most famous of them. He wrote novels and ran a newspaper, but he also was a pamphleteer. At some point in the summer of 1709, Defoe publishes this, A Brief History of the Poor Palatine Refugees Lately Arrived in England. So one of the things he wanted to do was to promote this idea of the Palatines as a source of potential revenue. The problem, of course, is that it's very expensive to send people across the Atlantic at this time. The Queen and the government aren't interested in funding them to any great degree.
Parishes in England, by this time a Protestant nation, initially raised £20,000 to support the Palatines, as they believed they were Protestants, like themselves, fleeing Catholic persecution.
Catholic France was really on a rampage in Europe. They were taking over territories, Protestant territories. They were seen as a tyranny and as a religion that helped tyranny. So I think that's part of the reason why this notion of Protestantism was incredibly important to both the elites in government, but also to ordinary people. There is a very real sense that these poor Palatines, they may be different, they may be from another country, they may be poor, but above all, they are seen as Protestant.
What do they start discovering about them?
The government trying to take a census of these people, they quickly learn that about a third of them are actually Catholic. And this really puts paid to the notion that they're simply Protestant refugees fleeing religious persecution. Some of them indeed had been affected and had suffered various oppressions because of their religion, but most were probably worried more about their economic conditions than about the sort of particular religious persecution that was going on. The problem, of course, was that if you were in London in 1709, you, like the Germans, had experienced high food prices. There had been a bad harvest in England as well, though not quite as severe. War against Spain was pushing up taxes and causing disruption to trade. So there were a good many people who were in a very poor state to begin with.
The English Poor Law held each parish responsible for its own poor. Local taxes were collected so that widows, the elderly, orphans and those unable to work could subsist.
Over the course of the late 17th, early 18th centuries, the number of people who were reliant on the poor law increased dramatically. Anyone from outside of the parish who was seeking charity could be classed as a vagrant, and that was a technical legal term that they used at the time. Someone who could be prosecuted, whipped, and sent back home. So the refugees were seen potentially as vagrants, and that's one of the reasons why, for people at the time, it became very threatening, because a bunch of poor people arriving, you're responsible for them.
3,000 palatines were shipped to Ireland. 3,000 sailed to New York. Just 600 made it to North Carolina, and of the 6,000 remaining, some made their way back to where they had come from, and a few stayed to make a life in Britain.